Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about why an identity-centric security view is so relevant right now, and honestly, how we're doing somewhat of a bad job at it. My name is Max Horn, and I lead Okta's EMEA consulting practice, and hopefully that's all I'll say about Okta or myself. Now, on to why we're here. In today's business environment, almost every organization has experienced a serious security breach, will soon be breached, or has been breached but doesn't yet know it. The uncomfortable truth that I guess most IT and security professionals know is that if a persistent attacker wants to gain access to an organization's network or sensitive information, they usually can. It's just a question of time and effort. Take Stuxnet, for example. And if you don't immediately know what I mean when I say the word Stuxnet, write it down and Google it. It's definitely worth the read. To prevent security breaches, we do all sorts of things like, web application, firewalls in general, antiviruses, SIEMs, that's security and event management for those that haven't worked with those before, endpoint monitoring, malware sandboxing, cloud application security, and so on. These point solutions are designed to protect against infrastructure tampering whilst monitoring data flow. We do these things to present a harder target, much like putting a chunky padlock on our bicycle to deter the attacker from ours to go after an easier target. In a strange way, in today's world, security is now somewhat competitive. I don't really need to be the fastest runner to outrun the tiger chasing me. I just need to run faster than you. Infrastructure security technologies offer adequate defensive controls, but they don't typically address one of the most strategic concerns, identity and access management, or IAM. Really, we're talking about credentials here. These solutions I've just mentioned can be difficult to implement and to manage, and they often create mountains of data and reports and identified incidents or threats that are pretty much just overrunning the available resources you have. And what's worse is that even with these fortifications in place, IT and security teams are still powerless against newer and more sophisticated attacks on end user credentials. Verizon's data breach investigation report, a study of breaches each year, said 81% of hacking-related breaches leverage stolen and weak passwords. 81%. So think about it in a highly simplistic way. 81% of all hackers just logged in. How much of your or our security budget did we spend on addressing this instead of other cooler or more interesting ways of getting breached? Possibly none, possibly a little. I bet the sorts of purchases that might stop this kind of attack, they sometimes sit outside of a cyber budget. They sit within a corporate IT budget, a digital transformation budget, or perhaps even a business line budget if it's supporting the rollout of a new customer-centric thing like an e-commerce website or supplier portal. So not the supplier budget. And some people are aware of the 81% stat. What most people don't know is that it's up from 63% the year before. And if you ask me, I'd say it's only going to increase because they are so easy to do and we're doing so little to stop them. In a more mundane way, has anyone ever wondered why when you get those emails asking for your bank details from a foreign prince, they're always so bad, so misspelled, so unconvincing? And I bet we've often found ourselves thinking, there's no way I'd fall for this, or even a child could do a better job at this email. They're deliberately bad so they can pick up the lowest hanging fruit with zero effort on their end. If they snare even a half-awake victim, they might waste their time and be strung along until the last moment when the victim wakes up and gets cold feet. But this isn't the case if you're only targeting the most gullible by doing such a bad job on your initial email. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, why go after a hard target when I can go after a soft target? I could go and buy up a data trove on the dark web, mine it for credentials, password, and then do a spraying style attack, log in, maybe ransomware them for some Bitcoin. Honestly, I'm kind of talking myself into doing it now, and I play for the defensive team. And I'm sure some people on this webinar, on this call, might be thinking right now, all this talk about credentials, what about phishing? That's always in the news, and I've just spent my budget and my personal credibility on convincing the board to buy an email monitoring tool that was outside of budget. Well, the same Verizon data breach report also indicates that credentials are targeted in over 90% of phishing attacks. So the point of phishing is almost always to get your credentials so they can log in as you. And even if the point of the attack is actually the installation of software, in a phishing attack, this could be because the employee has not been trained properly, or they've really dropped the ball and they've clicked on something they shouldn't, they've downloaded something they shouldn't. The malware that's usually delivered is a keylogger. So we're back at credentials again. if you look at the Ponemon Institute's special mid-year report on hacking, they state that an insider breach is 3 times more damaging than an outsider. Your employees going rogue is worse than a hacker sitting offshore somewhere. And why is this? Because that's an interesting stat. It's because of the level of access that an employee has. The scary thing to me is what happens when it isn't an employee acting maliciously, but a hacker has their credentials and therefore they get access to everything that employee has access to. This needs to be stopped. And that's what we mean by identity-centric security. Most IT and security professionals understand that IAM is a critical component and a central pillar to maintaining adequate security, but they often struggle with ensuring the right balance between protection and usability, or friction, if you've heard it called that before. But when implemented correctly, modern IAM is often far cheaper than traditional legacy systems, and it covers 3 important bases: identification, authentication, and authorization. And these 3 areas, these 3 bases, they need to work across the cloud, mobile, on-prem, different devices. What you can't have is an identity silo forming, as you really need to be at a single pane of glass in order to be at your best. And that's where I'll start. Centralized and unified identity management. Your identity and access control infrastructure should be centralized and include a unified single sign-on authentication approach. Application sprawl, combined with separate user management across different departments that use different identity management systems, can create security gaps that are often easily exploited. Centralized identity management also helps reduce attack surfaces by automating the provisioning and, more importantly, the deprovisioning of user accounts. This eliminates orphan accounts that can be used by attackers to gain entry. A single pane of glass for managing your users also ensures access to appropriate applications and mitigates security weaknesses, and allows you to manage your users or apps by groups and set varying levels of security and therefore friction for each as it makes sense. And this is all with a centralized log that's being exported to an incident management or CM capability. And at this point, it's, when we think about single pane of glass, don't forget that M&A you've just done. You may have begun to allow the new directory, or more commonly directories, to federate into your identity provider. That's now a risk also, as you can't have that forming a separate silo. What would be better when we think about single panes of glass is if we had access to data beyond our own company's single pane of glass. At Okta, we've got a great example of defending against a state-level attack of another state, where, to our knowledge, all the critical infrastructure of the attacked state went down aside from the airport, as they were using Okta. We'd spotted the attacking state, doing malicious actions across our network globally, and so we're able to proactively and programmatically lock it out. I think this also raises the interesting point that when you do a deployment of a more traditional on-prem software, because each deployment is silo and therefore custom, you don't have the ability to get to a pane of glass that's larger than your own. This is the network effect. And for context, the attack I spoke about earlier, it was at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve. So, were your security teams monitoring traffic at that point in time? Were they at their best? I think with this, it's important that we can adapt and change our security posture, because an organization on a different, in a different industry, on a different part of the world is under attack, and we can do that programmatically and proactively. Next up, you've probably guessed I'm going to suggest multi-factor authentication, or MFA. This is so important that when the US Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency issued a notification to the North American market on the risks of moving to the cloud with O365, this was the primary fix they recommended. This technology is now a requirement for several compliance mandates, and to be honest, it's the best way to shore up security gaps caused by weak and hackable passwords. But one-time passwords or email links, these are slow and secure. Users want frictionless Apple iPhone-like experiences of technology, not pulling out legacy hard tokens to scribe across rotating numbers or waiting for a text factor and bagged signal. The factor itself can be faster. For example, biometrics, push, or even something like a YubiKey if it's a laptop you're using, as these plug into USB ports and they're honest, they're very usable and I love them. And if you put the factor to one side, the challenging itself can be smarter. When you authenticate into a system, you've got a lot of context. You've got credentials, the username and password. You've got past years of behavior. You've got third-party intelligence if you're using inline hooks out to an identity proving service or a bot tracking service. You have the device. Is it known? Is it registered? Is it in our MDM? You have physical network. Are they on the office IP? Are they at the same IP address that they've been at for the last 6 months? You know, their home IP address, or are they somewhere new? You've got geolocation. And all of this, we have all of this context, but most people just throw all of this away and they use just a username and password, because passwords are never the same password with a 1, then a 2, then a 3, then a 4, then a 5 after it. And usernames are never first name dot last name at company.com. Smart MFA or adaptive MFA can use all of this context and decide when and if to challenge a user based on what's going on. And this removes the need for unnecessary prompts that would barely increase security posture for a normal user doing a normal activity. Also, when I talk about this context, you could actually take it a step further and you could consider a credential as only one piece of context, or even potentially an insecure piece of context, and move away from them, move to a passwordless future that your users will love. I'd note that your employees, especially your older ones, are somewhat used to and tolerate corporate IT being slow and perhaps clunky. Anyone who's ever tried to pull down an engineering drawing on an ERP system knows exactly what I'm talking about. But younger employees, or even your externals like your customers or business partners, demand better, and we need to do better. This is the adaptive piece. The adaptive piece is far more important here, as you won't be able to get your customers, for example, to use a specific factor you want, but you can choose to only MFA them as part of a step-up authentication when they're doing something sensitive, and when it's from a new device and a new IP zone. And plus it saves money because text factors cost money. So if you send out less challenges, you spend less money. So if you've got all of your identities in one place, you've got centralized management, you've got SSO to reduce friction and log-on attempts, you've got a complex password that's protected by smart MFA policies with advanced factors, and you've got an identity provider that is scanning every global customer of theirs to ensure that you're proactively defended when a DDoS or something else kicks off. You'd be set, right? Almost. You need automated lifecycle management, which I mentioned earlier. This reduces huge amounts of cost from the manual work of provisioning and deprovisioning people from directories and downstream apps. And this allows centralized policies to be implemented automatically without waiting for a manual human intervention. As when someone leaves a company or they're fired, they need to be instantly deprovisioned. And the first system to know is HR. If this data isn't instantly flowed out to your directories and your downstream apps, you could have a problem. I mentioned earlier in this talk the Ponemon Institute's special mid-year report on hacking when it stated that an insider breach is 3 times more damaging than an outsider. Everything I've spoken about is something that Okta is doing right now and has been doing for a while. Thanks for listening.